He's a former investigative journalist. During his career, he investigated parole boards. He's here to talk about what we do not know. He also covered and reported on the Branch Davidian raids, also known as the raids in Waco, Texas, and reported on that. He's going to give us first-hand information. He's a podcaster, a host of the True Crime Reporter podcast. He's coming up on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, the realities of investigating crimes, plus those who have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. If you're on the Clubhouse drop-in audio chat app, be sure to look for me and follow me. My name's John, the letter J, Wiley, W-I-L-E-Y. You can also search for at LET Radio Show. That's John J. Wiley, W-I-L-E-Y, at LET Radio Show on the Clubhouse drop-in audio chat app. Contact is from Dallas, Texas. We have Robert Riggs on the phone. Robert is a former investigative journalist. He is here to talk about investigating parole boards. Also, he covered the Branch Davidian Waco raids that were so disastrous and talked and reported about that. He's host of the True Crime Reporter podcast. True Crime Reporter is the name of the show, and his website is robertriggs.com. Robert, thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Well, glad to be talking to you from the great state of Texas.
It's good to have you here. There's so much about, we're going to talk about the Waco raids. A lot of people seeing that. I watched some of that. I can't stomach watching it. We'll talk about what that was really like. I've had, I think, 2 guests on since 2017 that were there. One was in the ATF, and he talked about what that was. We're also going to talk about investigating parole boards, something we know nothing about, but we scratch our heads quite often, like, why did they come up with those decisions and let people back out on the streets? Stuff baffles me. Are you a retired investigative journalist now, or former, or what term do you like?
I still do some investigating around the podcast and all, but I'm not the full bore down in the dirt anymore. Although I see reporting today's, and I think maybe I should go back to that.
I was going to ask you next, because I remember investigative journalists that were the real deal. Nowadays, what passes for investigative journalism, I'll be honest with you, I don't think they can investigate their way out of a wet paper bag. How about you?
Oh, I agree with you. The money is not there, but what really is not there is the backbone of the old media corporations. They just can't take the heat. I'll give you an example. I remember when I was reporting on Hamas fundraising, and their base was here in Dallas. And I was working for CBS, and their biggest concern was, we're going to have demonstrators outside the station. It wasn't about the reporting and the quality of the reporting and the risk to the country. It was about, we're afraid we'll get criticized. And that really is just exponentially increased, where I always say journalism left me.
Yeah, I think it did. It's fair to say the days of the Walter Cronkites and all those people are gone. And nowadays, and I'm asking a formal question, nowadays it seems like so much of what we see is opinion and punditry. It's not journalism at all.
I'll tell you why that is the reason. It's cheap to do. It's just talk. Digging and spending days, weeks, months on an investigative story is expensive.
Yeah.
And they don't want to pay for it. And the other thing the trend I saw happening is that even if you're right, and I had a big argument one day with this CBS lawyer out of New York, and they do pre-broadcast review, and he was objecting to the story. They didn't want to do the story, and I said, look, every sentence, I've shown you every sentence of this story is supported by documents. He said, I don't care about that. I don't care if it's accurate. We just don't want to get sued. So when you do that sort of censorship, self-censorship, what's the point anymore? I knew at that moment, hey, the clock's ticking on me.
Yeah. And things have changed. And by the way, I always say this jokingly in a sarcastic manner, Things like Watergate would never be reported today. You would not do that. It doesn't matter where you stand politically. It just would not make the press because no one's covering that stuff. No one's doing the groundwork.
Yeah, the heart of good journalism, the way we used to do it, was beat reporting. And I always used to say the best place for rookie reporters to start is on the police beat.
Right.
The best place. You're going to see, the human experience. You're going to see what officers go through, the challenges. You're going to understand how to talk to people, question people, and research. Doesn't happen anymore. It's all really kind of quickly done. I was from the school where I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm just going to present some facts, and this is what you ought to think about. That now it's all about, I want to pander to my audience. My audience is in the right, or my audience is in the left, or wherever, but I'm going to pander to them.
Right.
I do not want to alienate them because I've got to make money.
Right, and it's really we had a saying in Baltimore that when it came, especially to their print news, the newspapers, if it bleeds, it leads. And they make the headlines as dramatic as possible. And quite often the headlines don't, when you read the whole story, it vindicates the police and says, oh, they acted accordingly. But you read the headlines, first paragraph, it sounds like, oh, it's totally different. They start with the end last. Cop shoots unarmed man. Well, they don't talk about in the headlines the 15 decisions that guy made beforehand that would have probably had a different outcome.
Yeah, John, it's clickbait.
Yeah.
That's what it is. They're so desperate for an eyeball. It's clickbait. And unfortunately, a lot of people, that's all they read. They read that headline, or maybe they read the first sentence, and they don't get into the meat of it, of what happened.
And I got to ask you this last question before you go into your story. And this is in the form of a question. There was a time where a reporter, an investigative journalist, journalist of any ilk whatsoever, would never frame a story around a question that was raised unless there was something to substantiate it. Now, people make questions based off of their opinion, and especially in television news, and all of a sudden that becomes the story for the next 48 hours. Well,
as the curmudgeon lady on Wendy's used to say, where's the beef?
That's right.
Yeah, where's the beef? There's not much protein in there now. It's like Fruit Loops. It's candy coated, it's sugar and all, but it's probably no nutritional value at all.
And the thing is, and I just don't even, there's an old saying, I believe it's Mark Twain, never argue with an idiot. They'll just drag you down to the level and beat you with experience. And I always say, especially on social media, because then it's in a public forum, but you cannot convince these people that they're not 100% correct. And one of the things I say to my daughters all the time, they say, oh, I love this celebrity. Oh, I hate that celebrity. And they hate when I ask them this. I'll say, have you met them? Do you know anything about them? No. Oh, what are you basing that off? What the news said. Oh, so is that someone you've met, someone you know, someone has impact on your life, or are you just basing off their opinion?
Yes. And that's pretty typical, I think, of a lot of the public today. And people literally live inside social media. And I'm going to sound like an old, fuddy-duddy.
Well, join the club because I'm right there with you.
I think social media is the worst thing that's ever happened to this country.
I don't know if it's an extension, Robert, of the bad stuff, or if it's I always say this. I'm big on Facebook, and literally it is the fuel that fuels my radio show, my podcast, and generates revenue for me. It really, really is effective. However, you really have to focus on who your audience is and what you want. You want to attract, I always use the terminology like fishing. You can fish, or you can use chum, bait, to try to attract the fish you want to the area. And that's the thing a lot of social media does. But the problem started well before that. You can find us on Facebook. Look for and like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show Facebook page. We're going to continue our conversation with Robert Riggs on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. I promise you, we'll be right back.
Do this quick test. Go to a job recruiting website and type in social media marketing and see how many jobs there are and what they are paying. Facebook alone has more than 3 billion registered users, and studies show that more than 68% of them use it every month. Learn how to use Facebook to significantly increase your reach, and you could earn an extra revenue source from Meta too, like I do. To do that, you need to know what to do and what not to do. Get step-by-step directions and tips. Sign up for a free membership at letbreak.com. letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. It's free. And get the latest crime and law enforcement news on the Newsbreak app. It's simple, easy, and free. Just download the Newsbreak app. Then search for and follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Return a conversation with Robert Riggs on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Robert is an investigative journalist. He was full-time. Now he's kind of part-time. He covered the Branch Davidian raids, investigated those, reported on those, which we'll talk about in a few moments. He's hosted the True Crime Reporter podcast, and his website is robertriggs.com. Very easy to remember. It's robertriggs.com. Or do a Google search for True Crime Reporter podcast, and you'll find both. Branch Davidian. A lot of people, this is what baffles me, Robert. A lot of people I talk to nowadays have no idea what I'm talking about. I say the Branch Davidian raids, like, what are you talking about? Waco, Texas, what are you talking about? Ruby Ridge, what are you talking about? They have no idea, as if it was ancient history. It really was not that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
And I was there for all 51 days. I was among the early reporters who arrived there after they killed those ATF agents.
I watched the video of the raids and was horrified about the tragic loss of life, the tragic injuries on both sides. But I can't watch it, to be honest with you.
Well, the horror, and I reported this shortly after it happened, the horror is that those agents weren't told that the religious cult knew they were coming. And they were armed to the teeth, and we certainly saw that at the end there once they did the forensics on their gun vaults and everything. But they said in their briefings right after it, surprise and everything. It wasn't. I broke a story because I had I knew ATF agents who were on the raid, who had been sources of mine, friends of mine, and I got the straight story from them. And then there was another reporter out of Louisiana, and there were some Louisiana agents killed as well, and he had gotten the same story. So separately, we broke the story that, no, they knew they were coming. They had been tipped off, and they should have never gone. And because it was no surprise, the cult members were waiting. I mean, they had 50 calibers.
Right.
I knew an ATF agent who drove the pickup pulling a cattle trailer into the place. They were trying to make it look like they were bringing cattle in for the ranch next door. So the agents were in the two cattle trailers. Right off the bat, he took a 50 caliber round through the block of his pickup truck, the engine block. And he, by the way, is the guy that wounded David Koresh. And Koresh even talked about him on the tape. But it was just a slaughter. It ended up being a slaughter. It was just so needless.
Here's the thing about Robert that really bothers me, and I'm not picking sides, and I don't want to say, and I really hate when people do this. Well, if I was there, I would have done this, and especially the so-called tactical experts. And my answer to that is, you weren't there, so shut your pie hole. You don't know what you're talking about. It's great to have an opinion. We had some basic things that we learned in policing, and granted, I policed a long time ago. And I was not part of a SWAT team. I didn't do that stuff. I didn't do the rah-rah stuff that we talk about. However, we never responded under someone else's terms. And we never let them set the table. This is how it's going to be. And by the way, a term that's thrown around quite a bit nowadays, and I'd love to get your response on both of these, is de-escalation. De-escalation is an end result. It takes both sides to do that. You can't do that on your own. You can't make someone else move off their platform. And a lot of people would say David Koresh and the Branch Davidians knew exactly what they wanted. They got what they wanted, and they started it.
Well, I really intimately knew Waco because at the time this happened, I was investigating a serial killer named Kenneth McDuff, Waco was his base for murdering women. So I knew a lot about it. I knew law enforcement, knew the area. And, the thing that struck me is, why did they just wait for him to come into town, David Koresh? I mean, Koresh, he was like a teenager in some respects. He drove a souped-up hot rod. Mm-hmm. I think it was a black Trans Am. And he wore this crazy leather motorcycle jacket with an emblem on the back. He went into town all the time.
He was looking for attention, that we call people like that.
Yeah. So, there were a couple of U.S. Marshals in Waco, the McNamara brothers, Mike and Parnell. Parnell is the sheriff there today. Really wise old birds. Family's been in law enforcement for 120 years as marshals in Texas. They could have surprised that guy, if they'd just been asked, if they'd just known. And we could avoid a lot. Now, I was among the first to arrive, and then you may recall, Koresh demanded to go on the radio. Mm-hmm. He wanted to talk live on the radio, and said, "Then we'll come out." I didn't believe it. I'm a reporter. I'm skeptical, and I will never forget. God, I must have done just two of us, a 3-hour-long live shot at the hospital, just listening to him talking about it and everything. And at the end of it, I didn't believe he was coming out because it was apocalyptic. It was his view of the Bible and the end and the 7 seals. It was all there. And if you'd been raised in the First Baptist Church like I had, you kind of knew, this boy is not coming out.
Right.
He's never coming out.
He also told people that this is what I want.
Yes. Yeah. So, and there we were, day after day. And, we broke the story that the ATF spokespeople were lying to us. I don't know if they knew they were lying, but they sure had been told that, they all suddenly, we arrived a few days into it, and they're gone. They've been replaced. And I think even the FBI spokesperson, he was replaced. It just discredited them.
It seems like I'm looking at Wikipedia right now, by the way, and it said that the siege was 51 days, and you talked about being there for every day, and it was April 19th, 1993. And there's so much that was, and people would say, Ruby Ridge had a lot to do with this. Some people would say Philadelphia Police Department doing a bombing on, I think it was Move, on their house, had a lot to do with this. A lot of response. And a lot of people don't take that in consideration. How do you respond to that?
I think that those two events you mentioned fed the distrust of the government, of people that distrusted the government.
Right.
And, kind of played in and confirmed their mindset. And then after the Branch Davidian siege, and by the way, I covered the trial as well. After it, the militia movement really took hold. And I discovered, a couple of years later, a Davidian who was not in there, who was upset that he had not been in there, who then came back and said he was David Koresh reincarnated. And I can't make this stuff up. He wore his hair like Koresh. He had gotten Koresh's leather jacket, the car, and he was Koresh reincarnated.
And back in the day, you and I probably would have mocked that guy. This is the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. We're going to turn our conversation with Robert Riggs in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You can find us on Facebook. Just search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and be sure to click like.
Did you know that Facebook has an estimated 3 billion active users all across the planet? Want to increase your presence and profit using Facebook? Learn how you can do that every day, like I do. Plus, you can earn revenue from Meta every month. All this without breaking the time bank. Learn how to work smarter and not harder on Facebook. Get step-by-step instructions on what to do and what not to do. Start with a free membership. Get details at letbreak.com, letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Return conversation with Robert Riggs on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Robert was a full-time investigative journalist, now part-time. He is been talking about covering the Branch Davidian Waco raids, which we'll continue talking about in a moment. They also did a lot of investigations. He did a lot of investigations of parole boards in Texas. He's the host of the True Crime Reporter podcast. And website is robertriggs.com. That's RIGGS.com. Robert, this thing like Branch Davidian, the raid on Waco, if you people listening and you're not sure what I'm talking about, just do a Google search. It'll come up. You'll find it. You can do a Google search on Ruby Ridge, find information as well. And be prepared. Some of it is kind of out there, to be totally honest with you. And you can look at Philadelphia Police Department dropping a bomb on, I believe it was Move. I can't remember the name of the group that they did. And also Oklahoma City. They're all kind of intertwined, aren't they?
Oh, they are. They are. They sort of fed each other. But that final event, the 51-day siege, the Branch Davidians, the fiery inferno at the end, that created Oklahoma City.
Yeah. Timothy McVeigh used that as his inspiration. He said that's part of the reason why he did what he did. My memory is correct.
Well, we were talking earlier about this young man, the Davidian, who wasn't there for the siege and everything, who said he was Koresh Reborn, wrote a pamphlet, a short book and everything, really tying all this together. And he was making the rounds to militia groups around the country, particularly in Florida and places, selling it and speaking about it. And I mean, he was widely read. He was articulate, good talker, and it was taking root out there. And so when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, by the way, I'd had stories about him. I was the only person who had stories about him. He was ignored by others. But to me, he was such an interesting figure, the fact that he's reincarnated, where's this going? And he's preaching this. And I called him, and I asked him, are you in Oklahoma City? And he laughed. He said, no, I'm not there, but I inspired it. I know who did it. And I went on the air right after that and said that this was a case of domestic terrorism.
Right.
Didn't come from outside the country. And I was, in those days, working for WFAA. It was the biggest ABC affiliate in the country. It was an amazing news organization, and not today. But ABC, the network, called and said, what the are you guys doing down there? This is international terrorism. I said, no, it's not. It's not. And then, of course, shortly after that, the Oklahoma State Trooper stops McVeigh, and it all starts to unravel. And then we began to see, yes, there was the inspiration for McVeigh and others. It was what had happened at all of these events, and it had just sort of gelled inside them and into a belief of a conspiracy theory and everything.
Right. Two things that I think need to point out. Number one, the state trooper that stopped him in McVeigh, he stopped him for a routine traffic stop. I believe it was a bad registration or expired tags or something.
It was.
It was not a big deal. And then they found out who he was and what he did and everything else, and one thing led to another. The other thing is, and I want people to understand, because we're talking about Ruby Ridge, we're talking about Waco, we're talking about Oklahoma City, we're talking about Philadelphia Police Department dropping a bomb on Move. It doesn't mean we are exalting or honoring these people. It just means we're discussing the facts. And the one thing that seems to be missing from a lot of the equation nowadays in journalism is facts. And it's all opinion-based. We talked about that before. And people, I talked earlier in Clubhouse. By the way, if you're on Clubhouse, just search for John J. Wiley or look for @LET Radio Show. It's a free app on your phone. I was in Breakfast with Champions this morning, and I said that a lot of what people are is they're falling for the feints. They're falling for fear. They're falling for fear-mongering, and there's no facts being reported. And people are making their decisions based off that. And that's not healthy. That doesn't change anything.
And hey, let's talk about that state trooper for a moment.
Yeah.
In today's climate, with the heat they've taken, How many troopers do you think would even make that stop?
Not many. I would say nowadays I wouldn't even recommend it.
Yeah, because I talked to troopers who were like, man, I don't want the trouble. I don't want to borrow trouble out there because I'm going to get accused of profiling and other things.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the shame of what has happened. And I've got
so many crimes have been uncovered, justice served, crimes interrupted based off routine traffic stops. And that's the first thing that some of these governments say they want to get rid of.
Exactly. Or, they get up to the window and, good troopers have, especially here in Texas, I don't know them elsewhere, but they have a way in their conversation of seeing how people react,
right?
How they talk,
right?
And that then can lead them to eyeball, what's in the car, just looking from outside. And here you go. They'll uncover stolen weapons and break big cases. It happens out there, shoe leather by the officers.
Well, that's old school stuff you're talking about, Robert. It's gumshoe police work. And I tell people some of the cases I got involved with. And I'll just tell you very quickly. I was a sergeant, and I pulled up next to a vehicle, and the guys in the car, there's 4 of them in the car, and it's a Jeep Cherokee. They didn't look right. They didn't even look at me. Most of the time, they were like, hey, look, there's a popo. They would, oh, my God, and there's a police nurse, so don't look at them. Number one, that got my attention. Number two, they had a Virginia State inspection on the windshield and a DC tag. That was a big red flag. And they committed very minor traffic offenses. When I pulled them over for the traffic offense, I called for backup. I saw a bulge under the floor mat. Turns out they had 5 guns, soft body armor, and about 500 rounds of ammunition. And they're there to do a hit out of DC.
There you go.
Right. That's just old-fashioned police work. You got to follow your gut. You build a case from your gut, but it all starts there. And when we take away that gut instinct, I think we endanger everybody else.
Yeah, I had a friend that was grew up with him as a kid, in the nursery together at the Baptist church, and 35 years, Texas trooper. And he used to tell me, Robert, when I put on the lights and they're pulling over, I can tell by the way they're pulling over if this is going to be good or there's trouble coming. And he always, he's actually critical of some of the troopers today. He thinks they're too robotic. But he'd start a conversation, and it would be in that conversation that he could ascertain, is this going to turn out well or badly? And do I have a bad guy or bad woman on my hands here? I don't know if they have the time.
I don't know that they have time, and certainly they don't have the experience of, and I'm not criticizing the police nowadays. What I'm saying is that, look, these people in prisons, which we'll talk about parole boards in a moment, these people in prisons, they practice this stuff all day. Predators practice not being observed by the general population. And if you are not aware and you don't look for the telltale signs, even as police, you could wind up being victimized. And that happens to people all the time. One of the things my daughters and I say, and my wife and I say, develop a mindset of, I'm not the one. If you've got bad intentions, I am not the one you want to take it out on.
That is great advice. Because so many people are just oblivious. They're just oblivious to what's going on around them. And I would say, that we live in very dangerous times. There's an element of this disorder and disrespect I see on the streets. And you can see it in the high burglary rates, property crimes, robberies in parking lots.
Right.
You can't base it on a murder rate.
No. And people, and so many politicians and so much news media is like, well, that's not a violent crime. That doesn't count. Yeah, it counts in my book. It really does. We're talking with Robert Riggs. He's a former full-time investigative journalist, still does a part-time. He's host of the True Crime Reporter podcast, and his website's robertriggs.com. We're going to talk about investigating parole boards. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Remember when news was free? Be sure to check out the Newsbreak app. It's free. And be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Newsbreak is your #1 local news app for current events, free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free. And be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. That's the free Newsbreak app. Be sure to look for and follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast.
Imagine earning an extra $500 to $5,000 a month or more from the comfort of your home or business, all with Facebook. That's right. Meta is paying people just like you every month. Learn how to create another revenue stream from Meta and dramatically increase your reach, all without breaking your own time bank. Sign up for a free membership at letbreak.com. letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Return our conversation on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show with Robert Riggs. He is a former full-time investigative journalist, old school. He just so does it part-time. He is the host of the True Crime Reporter podcast, phenomenal show. His website is robertriggs.com. Just do a Google search for either True Crime Reporter or Robert Riggs, and you will find both. One of the things that, and I appreciate you taking time explaining this, Robert, I appreciate all your hard work that you did in years past and you're still doing today. And we'll talk about your podcast in a moment, I promise you. Because that's part of the reason why you do what you do. One of the things that a lot of people don't get, and myself in particular, is like, what prompted this parole board to make that off-the-wall decision? And when you deal with, I think, any government agency, any bureaucratic group, you're going to get stonewalled. You're going to have a hard time. You ran into and investigated parole boards in Texas, didn't you?
Oh, indeed I did. Stumbled right into it. I had been a Washington correspondent, and before that, I was a staffer on a defense committee. I was an investigator for a congressional committee that worked on part of Watergate. So I'd spent a long time in Washington. I spent 3 years in New York, and I had covered the Reagan White House. And then George H.W., the beginning of his, and I was burned out. I was tired. And President Reagan's deputy press secretary, Larry Speaks, we'd been friends back when we were staffers in Congress and all, and you can't imagine the toll it takes. It's just, you don't ever have a day off. It's hours and hours. And I was burned out. And I asked, I sought a transfer, and I went to the state capitol in Texas. I loved it because it was laid back. You could wear your cowboy boots and jeans and sport jacket, just like the other members did. And Texas has an open floor for the press, and there's just a brass rail separating you from the members. Very laid back. You can talk to members. So I got there to that, but then I began to notice you couldn't turn on television or read the newspaper without a god-awful crime on the front pages and all. And at first I thought, oh, it's the old adage, if it leads, it bleeds.
Right.
But then I began noticing in every story buried, it would say that the offender was out on early parole. And I saw it over and over, and I began having this conversation on the floor with a state senator named Ted Lyon. He was the chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee, but he was an ex-policeman, ex-cop. And he had gone to law school at night while he was on the beat. We began to discuss it like, there's something wrong here. And that started the digging. And it's a long story about the digging, but eventually what I uncovered is there was a parole selling scheme on top of a scheme to release literally hundreds of inmates to keep the state out of trouble with the federal government. The state had been in trouble with a federal judge for, over 10 years for prison over crime. And really, instead of building more beds and spending money, both parties, they were both guilty of this. They all ran on re-election of law and order, get tough, and they kept passing tougher laws, particularly drug laws. But they didn't have any place to keep these people.
Right.
And the state jails were all backed up. So what started happening is literally the parole board, which was politically appointed, all political appointments. Nobody's trained, and nobody's been a police officer. Nobody's trained in psychiatry or anything but instead of criminal mind. They started releasing 150 inmates a day, and to relieve overcrowding. And so suddenly, finally, in a moment of honesty, one of the parole board members under fire by Senator Lyon, who had hearings from my reporting, admitted, well, we're in the bottom of the barrel. And indeed they were, but because it was this wholesale release, well, the chairman of the parole board saw an opportunity to make money. Who's going to notice? Who's going to notice you releasing bad guys and you're taking money? And so he started a whole pay-for-play deal. Mm-hmm. And I uncovered that more than 65 former death row inmates had been paroled. How did that happen? Well, their death penalty sentences had been commuted to life in 1972 when the Supreme Court overturned the death penalty. No one imagined you'd ever let these. I mean, these guys were monsters.
Well, back then, life meant life to most of us. It meant you're going to die in prison.
Well, it meant you were going to sit in Old Sparky.
Right.
In those cases. And so they're out. And in investigating it, I discovered that a guy was out that had taken 5 Dallas sheriff's deputies hostage, lined them up for execution, murdered, shot 3 of them, shot a 4th as he was running, and a 5th got away, dived into the Trinity River. And he's out. He was out. I broke that story, and law enforcement across this state went crazy, couldn't believe it. But I also had in the story, there was this other guy, Kenneth McDuff, who had abducted 3 teenagers, brutally raped the girl. He became known as the broomstick killer because he did part of it with a broomstick. And it was a horrible crime. And he was out. And I got on his trail and started investigating how did he get on parole. And I discovered that he's a suspect in the disappearance of a convenience store clerk in Waco, Texas. And here we go. I'm on a path of trying to find out, how's this guy out? And on the same path are 2 U.S. Marshals and a U.S. prosecutor. I mentioned the Marshals earlier, the McNamara's. The prosecutor was Bill Johnston, and these guys they were tough. And Johnston, as a federal prosecutor, had decided, listen, this crime rate is so bad because all of these people getting out of prison, I'm getting them on federal charges. So he was putting people away left and right because the state wasn't doing it.
And federal charges means no probation, no parole. If you get 25 years, you do every day of it.
Yeah, more than a lot of people doing. Yeah, he never lost a case.
That's awesome.
There are a lot of
I remember, and we're going to switch to your podcast. I remember, and it's still to some degree true, but places like Houston, Galveston, Dallas, they had horrendous violent crime problems through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s.
It was this early release. I call it midnight release. I'll give you an example. There's a section in prisons, I'm sure you've seen them, called administrative segregation,
right.
or ADSEG.
Right.
Prisons within the prison for the most violent, incorrigible, gang members, you name it. In the dead of night, they were taking them out one by one, shackling them in vans, taking them to the bus station in Huntsville, handing them a bus ticket and said goodbye.
That's it. That's a crazy.
You could not put 2 of them in a van together because they might kill each other. And we turned them loose. So Houston turned out to be a big dumping ground.
Houston adds, and I say that because when I was early in my police career, I almost considered moving to Houston and joining their department. But it made Baltimore, which was horrendous at the time, look like a walk in the park. We're talking with Robert Riggs, and we got to switch gears about your podcast. True Crime Reporter podcast. It's kind of a big deal for you. It's a big deal podcast as well.
Well, I started during the pandemic. It was a reaction. My family had been involved in law enforcement. My father had been a police commissioner. And I hated what was being said about police officers because I knew that, the majority, they're professional. And, are there professional doctors and are there bad doctors?
Yeah.
Certainly. Same in police.
And some of those doctors are killers.
Yeah. And so I said, look, I'm going to do a podcast. You're going to hear the officers that do the cases. You're going to hear their level of dedication, their concern for victims. We're going to tell this other story. And right off the bat, I did a co-production deal, and I turned the Kenneth McDuff serial killer part of the podcast into 5-part documentary for Fox Nation. But I continued on. And number one, my mission was, hey, I want you to see the good work of law enforcement. You don't hear these stories, and I want you to hear their dedication. I want you to hear. I had an FBI agent on recently who, all these years later, there's one case, and I think all of these guys have one case, these men and women, that haunts them.
Yep.
And this is a tough FBI agent. And he teared up on the podcast, choked up.
And look, Robert, it's true. It's not the ones that we successfully prosecuted that bother us. It's the ones you couldn't, especially ones where you have an idea who did it, but you can't get this thing called probable cause and evidence in court. Joe, go online to robertriggs.com. That's ROBERTRIGGS.com, or just do a Google search for True Crime Reporter Podcast or Robert Riggs, and you will find both. Robert, thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'd love to come back because I want to talk to you about how I'm trying to work with law enforcement to solve cold cases using artificial intelligence.
This was the podcast version of the nationally syndicated Law Enforcement Talk radio show, and we are so glad that you decided to join us. Big thanks to our guests for telling their story on the show. 2 simple things you can do. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com. That's letradio.com. And be sure to follow us or like us on Facebook. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Talk radio show. And be sure when you see a post that we put up that you like, that you resonate with, that gets your attention, be sure to share it with your friends. We'll be back in just a few days with another great episode of the show. See you then.